Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 33. They're looking for us, aren't they? They knew something. Mari could read Shem and Peto's faces better than their wives, and it was the exchange they shared as Guide Zenas left Rector Shin's office that evening that clued her in. Something was happening on the other side of the mountain. She positioned herself at the front door as Shem approached. "Heading home for the evening?" she asked amiably. "Yep, just had to go over a few things with Peto, but I finally get to go home, unless you needed something, Mari." She folded her arms. "Don't want to keep you from Kala, so let's just cut to the point. What's happening?" "Nothing's happening, Mari." His eyes revealed nothing. Years of living in the world and lying about his identity had made him an excellent liar, but not perfect. Mari pointed to his face. "That eyebrow, it twitches ever so slightly when you lie. I've always noticed that, but I never let on until now. And now I want to know what's happening. It's Edge, isn't it? Tell me." Shem took her gently by the shoulders. "There's always something happening, but it's not always meant for you to know." Mari peered around him to see Peto a few paces away. "So what is it, Peto? I know that look in your eyes as well." Immediately he tried to erase it, yet not knowing exactly what his mother could see, he instead shifted his gaze erratically. "Oh, yes, definitely not garter material," Mari decided. "Please, both of you, what's going on?" Shem sighed. "The army's poking about in the forest, Mari. That's all, really." "It's true, Mother," Peto chimed in. "They finally noticed it's dead." "Did they make it to the boulders?" Shem hesitated only momentarily. "Yes." "They find the footpath?" "Doesn't seem like it." "How did they know to look north?" she inquired. "And why?" Shem and Peto glanced at each other. "And don't say nothing," Mari said sharply. "I'm not stupid, you know." The men smiled sadly at her. "No one was going to say you're stupid, Mari," Shem promised. "Perhaps excessively nosy," Peto began. Mari narrowed her eyes. "They're looking for us, aren't they?" Both men sighed heavily. "And who told them about us?" she pressed. "Was it—" She couldn't bring herself to say his name. "I'm fairly confident it wasn't," Shem assured her. "Maybe Amory or Anoki Kaya or Priscilla Thorne." Mari looked at Peto for confirmation. "We don't know," he admitted. "I'm just praying it wasn't him." A lieutenant walked in wearily to the mess hall line and got his plate for breakfast. A captain at a table signaled for him to join him, and the young officer obliged. He sat down on the long wooden bench across from the captain and sighed. "Let me guess, Kaya," the captain smiled. "Farmers in the southeast aren't too interested in housing 10,000 soldiers?" Lieutenant Kaya shook his head. "Dumbest reasons, too. They'll make the ground harder. They might spook my goats. Do they really need latrines? My woman wants to know what color the tents will be, and if she can arrange them by size on the fields." The captain chuckled. "We expected you back yesterday afternoon. Your corporals arrived and told Healy you were still trying to explain the intricacies of Army rights to the citizens. Healy will be wanting an update as soon as possible." I know," he said, spooning the cooked wheat into his mouth. "I was in negotiations until late last night," he garbled. "By the time I finished, I figured I just might as well stay until morning. No sense in riding 6 miles to the fort in the dark." "Negotiations, huh? Was she pretty?" "Pretty enough in the dark." The captain chuckled again. "Well, you've missed all the excitement the past 3 days." Kaya looked around. "Yeah, I thought something was up. The compound looks quiet for this time of morning. Are we training the new recruits somewhere else?" "In a way. Nearly everyone at the fort is up at the boulder field beyond the forest." It was a good thing the cooked wheat was soft, because Kaya could barely force it down. boulder field? That's right. And guess why? Thorn found out about the mysterious village. It's real. It's called Salem, and the main route to get there is from Edge. Kaya? Kaya, you're choking. The captain jumped up and reached over the table to smack Kaya on his back until the food cleared. Kaya, his face red, coughed and asked, Who told him? The captain sat down. It seems Miss Amory is from Salem. Kaya sagged in astonishment. Miss Amory? She used to be his woman, back before the little lieutenant arrived and had her booted out. And get this, he's from Salem. Thorn knows? I mean, Kaya panicked to backtrack. Private Shin? The captain didn't notice Kaya's slip. All this time, Shin was from Salem, and no one knew it. How did Thorn respond to the news that there are people here who know about Salem? He's looking for more. I bet he is, Kaya said under his breath. To reward them for information. Reward? Kaya squinted. You mean he hasn't killed Amory or the little lieutenant? The captain scoffed. Ugh, Amory is to be his queen, if you can believe that, once they get to Salem. He's planning to make a new kingdom. I don't believe it. Then try this. Private Shin is now confined to the dungeon. Kaya smiled. That I will believe. Thorn's trying to extract more information from him. Apparently Miss Amory knows all about Salem, but only Shin knows the way to get there, and he's not talking. At least not yet. He did reveal there are passageways through the boulders. There should even be one that can accommodate horses. That's the one Thorn's eager to find. Rubbing his hands, Kaya asked, He hasn't found it yet? He hasn't found anything yet. He's got 800 men testing every crevice from the marshlands to the beginning of the hill. Kaya let out a low whistle. Oof, that's got to be about 7 miles. That could take a while. Well, once we have the rest of the army here, it should take only a few hours to explore every remaining crevice. Yes, but the land tremor during the eruption changed the... Kaya stopped short. Changed what? Wouldn't it have changed the boulder field? He salvaged. Or maybe collapsed the trails? Or maybe made new ones? Kaya tapped his spoon against the bowl. He's really offering a reward? To the first man who finds a route through. Word is he might even get to command his own fort. Kaya pushed back the bench and stood up. Where are you going? The captain asked. Wouldn't you like to know? Soon he was heading out the northeast gates to the forest. His update for Healy could wait. Soldiers streamed in and out of the trees, and it was odd to see so much activity in an area that never saw any. Instead of joining them, he went east to the canal system. Once he reached it, he dropped into the dry canal and walked along the path next to it, heading north. Where the canal turned to go west, he climbed out and continued north, counting his paces. By the 21st pace, he was in the trees, exactly where he remembered he should be. There were only a couple of soldiers walking up to the boulder field, and they ignored Kaya as they passed him. He counted another 17 paces to the large boulder that most likely rolled down from the field decades ago. From there he turned northwest and walked again, counting. He knew he would make a large semicircle, as he had done over 2 seasons ago, but he also knew precisely where he'd end up. He didn't recite to himself the directions and number of paces every night and morning for nothing. He'd been waiting for this. So intent was Lieutenant Kaya in his walking and counting, creeping cautiously along the narrow passage that went between 2 large caverns that last year were belching a noxious odor, but this year were eerily quiet, that he didn't notice the general in the distance watching him, nor Miss Amory tugging on his sleeve. As he turned north again at the small clearing, he also didn't realize that the general and his consort were now following him at a distance. Kaya turned again, counting, and marching through the trees up a steep slope, passed a few more soldiers, and finally reached the boulder field. Thorn and Amory remained several paces behind him, Thorn frequently putting his finger to his lips to keep the other soldiers from speaking to him or alerting anyone to his presence. At the boulder field, the lieutenant evaluated the rocks before turning east, deliberately counting his steps. Thorn and Amory followed several dozen paces behind. Kaya had to step over several ropes that had been tied to trees and vanished into low caverns between the boulders. His lips silently moved, and occasionally he stopped and looked around before continuing. Thorn and Amory slowly gained on him, pausing when he did, watching for markers that he seemed to be looking for. Finally, Lieutenant Kaya stopped and stared at the boulders before him. Thorn held out his arm to halt Amory, and the two of them watched the lieutenant searching the rock. He gestured mutely to the boulders, drawing the attention of Major Twig, who was overseeing that part of the forest. Quiz sent a quizzical look to the general, but Thorn shook his head and continued to watch Kaya. Twig jogged noiselessly over to them. Kaya looked puzzled, put his hands on his hips, pointed lamely, then sighed. "Soldier," General Thorn said quietly, and with as friendly a tone as he could produce as he walked over to him. "Are you looking for something specific?" Startled, Kaya looked around him to notice that he had an audience of about 50 soldiers and officers. General, yes, no, Twig stepped over to the lieutenant. "General Thorn, this is Lieutenant Kaya. He joined the fort shortly after the eruption. I don't think you've met him yet." "No, I haven't," Thorn said. "Where did you serve before?" "In Winds, sir." "Winds. Are you sure?" Kaya licked his lips. Yes, sir." "Kaya, right? Because I understand you also spent some time in mid-plain. Is that right?" Kaya's face went white at Thorn's knowledge. Perhaps his brother Lick had mentioned him, or worse, Onus had said something. Yes, sir, a while ago." I see. So tell me, what are you looking for?" Thorn said with an encouraging smile. "You seem to have an idea about something." Sir, may I explain a few things? I wasn't exactly expecting to see you already, you see, and—" "Yes, that's obvious," Thorn cut him off sharply. "You know about the trails, don't you?" Kaya hesitated, then nodded. Thorn would get the truth out of him one way or another. He might as well get it now. "How?" Thorn asked. He took a deep breath. "Because, sir, under direction of 2 others serving in the army, I went to Salem just before the eruption." Thorn took an aggressive step. "You what?" Kaya tried to stand more confidently, but his knees were trembling. "I went to Salem, sir, with your wife and daughters." He stiffened in worry before letting drop his last piece of information. "Sir, I'm your son-in-law." For once, Thorn was speechless. No one around him dared make a sound as they watched the general, who seemed to have lost the ability to blink, along with the power to speak. Kaya withered slightly under his stare. After nearly a minute of torturous glaring, Thin whispered, "My what?" Kaya cleared his throat. "Son-in-law, sir. Noki Kaya. I made vows with Versa about 7 moons ago." Thorn narrowed his eyes. "Why?" "Because she discovered she was—" Kaya stopped, swallowed, then continued. "She was uncomfortable with our relationship until we made vows. She dug up some old rector from somewhere. She said we needed to be married." Thorn scoffed. "Ugh, sounds like her mother's influence. Where are they now?" Kaya stammered out, "Still in Salem." "No, they're not," Thorn told him. "They're not, sir?" "One of them was here a while ago. The one named—" Thorn searched his memory. "Priscilla." He snapped his fingers. "She came to the mansion." Kaya nodded. "Yes, sir, she came back with me. She didn't want to stay in Salem. Why not? Thorn asked slowly, suggesting that the answer to that question just might be the means of many ends. Kaya shrugged, unsure of what more to say. Then she missed the world. Huh. Well, then she died happily, said Thorn dismissively. Kaya's eyes grew large. She died, sir? I hadn't seen her for a while. I just assumed she left. Died breathing the herbs, Thorn said quickly, ready to move on to more pressing matters. So tell me, Anoki Kaya, whose claim to being my son-in-law is still very much in doubt, when did you return to Edge? About 5 weeks after the volcano erupted. Thorn's eyes flared. You've been here all that time? You knew? Kaya took a nervous step back. Sir, I was told not to reveal anything to you until the time was right. Who told you that? Sergeant Onus, he squeaked. Onus, Thorn shouted. As soon as he was dead, you should have come to me. I'm sorry, sir, Kaya stammered, but I knew what you did to my brother, and I... Thorn shifted. Your brother, he said, now intensely interested. Yes, sir, Kaya grew white. Captain Lick. Every man within listening distance gasped. But to all of their surprise, Thorn began to smile. Lick's brother. Slagging crate, I should have suspected. That little Zenus upstart kept claiming he had a way to know how to get to Salem, and now here he is, standing before me, shaking like a little girl. Kaya's chest heaved. Sir, I had every intention to return earlier. I didn't even want to go to Salem. I did all I could to try to convince those taking us to just tell me the way. Then I could have snuck away to bring you the news. It was during your celebration week. I fully intended to leave after I arrived in Salem and come tell you the location, but I was watched too closely. Several times I tried to escape, but they kept me there. Thorn narrowed his eyes with glints of planning. Salem kept you hostage? Kaya brightened, seeing his new cover. Yes, sir, they did. Against my will. It took me weeks of planning and timing just to get away. I narrowly escaped with Priscilla. We had men chasing us all the way to the boulder field. He told his story eagerly, as quickly as he could create it. We had to hide for days before we felt it was safe enough to sneak down into the forest. By then, we were so exhausted and dehydrated, I was sure we'd die without ever being rescued. I risked my life to come back, sir, to bring you this information. But then when I got here, I learned you were already in Idemia, and the time never seemed right. For the past 3 days, I've been speaking to farmers by the marshlands, trying to establish the camp for your army, sir. I'm trying to help you. That's all I've been trying to do. Fascinating, Thorn whispered, the planning in his eyes mushrooming to enormous sizes by the time Kaya finished. Fascinating that you haven't felt the need to reveal any of this until now. But you'll prove to be valuable, won't you, Kaya? Yes, sir, the lieutenant answered, losing confidence under the steady gaze of the general. So valuable, you'll now show me where the horse trail is. Kaya swallowed. I'm trying to, sir. It should have been right here, from what I remember. But none of this rock looks right. It all seems a little lower somehow. It was right here. He gestured vainly to the pile of boulders. You had to go around a little corner, but it was tall and wide enough for a horse. That's how we went, by horse. And there was a notch out of the boulder that spanned the entrance. I remember that the cut didn't look natural, as if someone took a hammer and purposely knocked off the edge. He stepped up to the boulders and searched for the stone he described. Several other soldiers joined him, looking at each edge and corner of the boulders. Suddenly, Kaya stopped. No, he whispered. He climbed on top of one of the boulders and, balancing on the uneven angle, stretched and ran his hand along to a notch. Sir, This is it. This was the spanning boulder, but it's collapsed. The land tremor when deceit erupted must have destroyed it. Kaya sat down on the boulder in frustration. Land tremor destroyed the horse trail? How convenient, Thorn said in a dead tone. Footpaths? Kaya shook his head, still staring at the stone. I never went on any, but supposedly they were marked from the top of the field. That's true, Amory said. They were marked clearly, but only from way up there. Lieutenant, Thorn said steadily, get down from the boulder. Kaya obediently slid down to the ground. Kaya, Thorn said in a careful tone, where are Drusus and her other daughters? Still in Salem, sir, as far as I know. Being held captive? Kaya squinted in confusion, then lit up. Sir, if I was held captive, then they certainly are too. Thorn nodded. So Salem abducts people from the world and holds them captive in their village. They did so with my father, sir, Kaya said earnestly. His name was Wallachia, and Zenas had him abducted many years ago and taken to Salem. Thorn began to smile. Zenas! I knew it! Kaya continued, seeing a reprieve. It took him several years to break free and return to the world. After 2 seasons of wandering, he finally returned to Scrub. That's where my brother and I were born. Lick told me about your father, Thorn said, that he was an older man and a bit crazed. So the stories weren't just your father's imagination, were they? Kaya straightened his back, full of new confidence. No, sir, and I was lucky to escape with my life, sir. Thorn studied Kaya. Major Twig, bring the lieutenant to the command tower. I have a few more questions that best not be discussed out here. Yes, sir, the major said, and gestured to the lieutenant. Kaya eagerly followed him down the forest. I should go with them, Amory suggested. Maybe I can help him remember names and places. Thorn caught her arm. No, my love. I'm sure we can handle this. But, she stammered, I really think I should question him, my love. The most important thing right now is to find a route through the boulders, right? I can help Major Twig. Tell you what, she smiled as she slid her hand up his left arm. I'll get him started, then you can come finish. All right, my love, Thorn simpered. I wanted to inspect this area more closely. I'll be only 10 minutes behind you. Wonderful, Amory beamed, and turned to follow Twig and Kaya down the forest. Thorn watched her progress for a moment, then turned back to the boulder field. I want every man here. 50 to start searching this section, another 50 beginning at that large tree, another 50 10 paces beyond that. Amory lifted up her skirt and did her best to trot gracefully down the slope to the major and the lieutenant. At a level clearing, she finally caught up to them and walked alongside. Major, allow me to take care of questioning the lieutenant here. I'm sure Lemuel could use some assistance up at the rock. Now that we have a good idea of where to look. Twig cleared his throat. Miss Amory, that's quite all right. In this case, I think I'm a little more experienced in what General Thorn wants than you are. Amory glared at him, as the lieutenant sniggered, and the major blushed. But you see, dear Major, the nature of the information Lemuel and I desire to know, you are not aware of. We have been hard at work with a great many plans, and you know nothing about Salem. The general will be coming to the command tower in 10 minutes anyway, and he'll only send you back up here. Miss Amory, I cannot go against a direct order. Then I'm ordering you, she said fiercely. As your future queen, I order you back to the boulder field. I will take care of the lieutenant. Major Twig stopped in surprise. As you wish, Miss Amory. I'll notify the general of your decisions. You may be excused then, she said, waving him away with a jerking motion. Lieutenant Kaya, you're with me now, she said, as she slipped her arm into his and continued down the hill at a brisk pace. Twig shrugged and walked back up into the forest. "Now," Amory said in a quiet voice, "what do you know of Salem?" "Ma'am?" "Come on, we don't have much time. I need to know who's in charge. That might give us a problem. Is the guide still Zenas?" she whispered. Kaya cleared his throat. "When I left, yes," he whispered back. "Whatever you do, don't tell Lemuel. Let me break it to him. What about the Shins? What do they think happened to their son?" "They know he left to go to the world, but nothing else." "Who's died?" she asked urgently. "Ma'am? I mean, is Mrs. Shin still alive?" "It's been a while, but she was when I left." "And how badly did the volcano hit Salem?" "Covered in about 10 inches of ash, but they cleared it out." "Deaths?" Amory asked. "From the volcano and pox?" "Tens of thousands, but not as bad as here. The world has just over twice as many people as Salem does now." "Are they armed?" "With weapons?" "Of course with weapons!" she snapped. "Not that I know of, but I stayed there only a few weeks and never saw much beyond where I stayed. I was held captive," he reminded them both. "Are the food reserves still intact?" she queried, her grip firming on his arm. "They have something like 4 years' worth." "Excellent," she breathed. "What's your intention?" "My intention, ma'am?" "Are you really his son-in-law?" "Yes, ma'am. As legally as I can be, I suppose." "Do you love her, your wife?" "Do I have to?" Amory snickered. "Was she just convenient?" "For getting into Salem, yes." "Are they still there? His wife and the 2 daughters?" "They were living at the second resting station when I left. They may have moved by now, supposedly to a house up in the northern village somewhere." "So what do you want from Thorn, Anoki Kaya?" Amory asked, her tone turning strident. I'm not sure. What's he offering?" She repositioned her grip, as if afraid he'd slip out of it as they trotted down the hill. "I know all about Onus and his plans, Kaya. He was with me trying to negotiate for my knowledge and my silence when Thorn had him dragged off to be executed. You and Onus and Varys were going to tell Thorn about Salem for a price, weren't you?" Kaya's breathing became more shallow. "And your brother Lick, the 4 of you had originally agreed to demand half the riches of Idamia," Amory continued, pulling Kaya closer as he tried to drift away from her. The end of the forest was approaching, the fort growing nearer. "Lick intended to march the army into Salem and demand to rule it as revenge for what Salem did to his father. So what were you going to get?" I, the lieutenant stammered. "None of this was my idea," he insisted. "It was my brother's. He wanted revenge on Salem. I just went along with it because of your father-in-law's rage. You're the only one left alive, Lieutenant Kaya," Amory said in an overly calm voice. "Thorn killed each of them. Or should I say Corporal Kaya? That's as far as you advanced before you quit the army, isn't it? This uniform is courtesy of Onus, just as Lick's was. And just as Lick, you're serving under an assumed command, aren't you? With a little bit of meat in him, Onus was quite open about things. You're no officer, are you?" Kaya's gait slowed, but Amory kept a hold of him and continued to rush him down through the thinning forest. "Miss Amory, what are you going to tell the general?" "I'm going to tell him what I think he needs to know, Kaya." "And what is that, ma'am?" His voice was tremulous. "That you are dangerous, Kaya. That you are a threat to our plans. You see, this is my game. Mine and Lemuel's. There isn't room for a third player. You possess information about Salem, and you know who's still living there. Well, that could ruin my strategy, and I won't allow that." "Miss Amory," Kaya said, his tone panicked, "I don't want to play any game. I don't want any reward. I don't want anything from you or the general. I just want to live in quiet. I don't even want to be acknowledged as the general's son-in-law, and I certainly don't want his daughter. Please, just let me go, and I promise I'll never make any demands or ask for anything, nor will I say anything about Salem that you don't want me to say." They were leaving the edge of the forest, the field before them leading to the fort walls and gates. "What assurance do I have that you'll not go back on your word?" Amory demanded. "That in 5 or 10 years from now you won't show up in King Lemuel's throne room demanding something from our kingdom?" I Kaya stammered again as she nearly dragged him through the field. "I don't know how to prove it to you, ma'am. I'll even quit the army if you wish. You name it, I'll do it." Amory smiled as they strode through the gates. "What an excellent answer. Precisely what I wanted to hear. In the meantime," she cleared her throat and shouted, "Guards, arrest this man. He's not a real officer. He's an imposter. Take him to incarceration." Amory learned a few things that day about issuing orders. The most important was, when calling for guards, make sure guards are available. As she looked around the nearly empty compound, she remembered too late that whoever wasn't up in the forests was training the new recruits in the fields beyond the fort. The only ones in the compound were the 3 surgeons, their assistants, and 30 men learning basic aid. None of them were in a position to render Amory assistance, even if they wanted to, because they were already tied up, and quite literally. Most of the men lay on the ground with various wounds, while the surgeons showed their new aides how to splinter broken limbs and stop bleeding. A surgeon looked over to Amory, held up handfuls of bandages, and shrugged his apology. No one else looked up from their work. But one of the injured, a hefty man known more for his philosophy than for his productivity, not that he could have been too productive since both of his broken legs were at the moment bound in wooden splints, commented loudly, "An imposter? Truthfully, aren't we all untrue to the truth within us? Aren't we all impostors, posing as something more imposing than our true natures truly are?" Several men lying around him nodded in agreement. "True, true, very true. Well said. We are all impostors." Amory didn't have time to deal with their inadequate responses, because the moment she yelled for guards, Kaya yanked at his jacket with the arm Amory wasn't clutching and quickly undid his buttons, popping a few off in his frantic effort to rid himself of the uniform. In an instant he wriggled free, leaving Amory holding only a sleeve with no Kaya in it anymore. He was sprinting out of the gates, shouting, "Jacket's yours! I resign!" He undid his sheath and sword as he ran, dropping them outside the gates, and vanished. Amory threw down the jacket, picked up her skirt, and ran after him. She passed the gates and saw Kaya running full speed to the east and the canal system. She did her best to catch up, cursing her skirt and dainty boots as she went. Kaya disappeared into the empty canal, and a minute later Amory reached it. She looked down to see only the distant back of Kaya, dashing south. "Slagging Zenuses!" she whispered in a fury. "Lemuel's going to kill me!" Trying to catch her breath, she planned her next moves. He'd be stupid to return, wouldn't he? But it doesn't matter, because he revealed all we needed. She smiled and brushed down her skirt. "Oh, yes, my love. Kaya will not be a concern or a threat. You see, he confessed all he knew as we walked. Yes, he broke away and ran to escape, realizing that his knowledge was a threat to us, but he was stopped, Lemuel, down past the canal where the marshes begin. Some eager soldier chased him down for us, hacked him to death. His body is in pieces in the marsh. Terrible scene. Thank goodness the ice is beginning to melt, so his body can submerge in it. The name of the soldier? I'm not sure, my love. He didn't have a uniform, you know, just blue trousers and work shirt. And he was so excited to have done something with his new sword that he was rushing home to show his woman and friends that he'd bloodied it for you. Don't worry, Lemuel. She practiced her story as she started back to the fort. "I'm sure he'll show up for you to thank him. And if he doesn't, that's one less person who'll be knocking at your door asking for a reward." What did Kaya reveal? Much of what I already knew. But Lemuel, it's time you knew the truth, the entire truth about Salem. Kaya was right. They are holding prisoners, hostages, for years on end. The situation has become more dire, and there's only one man who can fix it. You, my love, are just the man to bring Salem to justice. Staff Sergeant Beavid looked over the 8 men assigned to him and internalized a sigh. It wasn't as if Beavid was one to question the judgment of the general, but to hear that Thorne himself had handpicked Beavid's men made the sergeant wonder exactly how much time the general had spent on the matter. The men stood in formation, or as close to formation as they could with their week and a half of training, and regarded Beavid with as little confidence as he regarded them. Beavid puffed up his chest importantly. While he was of average size, he was muscular and able. He wished he had let his short curly hair grow a bit more, if only for warmth. Edge was cooler than the South. His nearly black eyes evaluated each of the men, and they analyzed him back. Until yesterday, Sergeant Beavid was sure being the nephew of a lieutenant colonel from trades was a good thing. Even though he'd met that uncle only once, he was sure his connections would land him a choice position when he arrived early in Edge. Now he had no choice but to take this position handed to him by the general. "Men, I congratulate you in earning this assignment. That General Thorne selected you says something of your ability and dedication." Beavid couldn't believe he said all of that with a straight face. Neither could one of his new privates, a portly man with thinning hair in his late 30s who rolled his eyes. Beavid glared at him for his insubordination, but the man was used to younger men glaring at him. He'd been a school teacher for 15 years. It'd take a lot more than that to intimidate him. "As you may or may not know," Beavid continued, "I am one of the sergeants in charge of security, and we've been given a most important task for which I'll be training you in the next week." 2 new recruits, hulking men in their late 20s who, until recently, were blacksmiths, nodded in appreciation and began their own whispered conversation. "Hey!" Beavid barked. "Iron, hammer, pay attention." The 2 men blinked in surprise at their new names and stood a little more stiffly. 2 more soldiers, pasty boys barely at the end of their teens, if what they put on their forms was to be believed, looked at the sergeant with worry. Another man, with skin as dark brown as Beavid's, stared off into the distance, seemingly captivated by a cloud. Beavid wondered if he'd been given a Gracina survivor. It would have been too much to hope for that he didn't get any, since the ones who wandered in to sign up were spread around to every group. The 7th man stood obediently at attention, the only other man who'd been a member of the army before it exploded in size. An 8th man, oddly gray in complexion, smirked expectantly. The sergeant made a mental note to keep a close eye on that last one. He looked a little too keen. "In less than a week, the rest of the Idamean army will begin to arrive. Then General Thorne will lead the entire army north into the mountains beyond." He watched their faces. As the date drew closer, soldiers became less apt at hiding their apprehension about the whole venture. His 8 reflected sufficient anxiety, except for the last one. "At that time," Beavid continued, "our services will be needed. General Thorne will be insisting that his prisoner in the dungeon accompany him in hopes that he'll reveal information to help us locate Salem." The teacher squinted. "Wait a minute. Prisoner in the dungeon? How long has he been in there?" 3 days. Several of the soldiers squirmed. The teacher scoffed. "Will he even be alive in a week?" "Supposedly, yes." "And we're here because—" Beavid hesitated before saying, "He may pose a flight risk." The teacher barked a laugh. "Ugh, he'll be skin and bones. He won't be able to walk. There needs to be 9 of us to control him. My grandmother could control him if she weren't dead. 9 will be exactly what General Thorne's son needs to keep a close eye on him, Beavid said firmly. The teacher's jaw dropped. Shin? We're guarding Shin? The other soldiers also looked dismayed. Yes, Perrin Shin will be our special duty, you could say. The teacher frowned. I heard he was run off somewhere. I heard he was still in incarceration, said another. Do you see that cloud? I heard he was dead, said the gray-faced soldier, sneering. You all heard wrong, Beavid broke in. Before he could continue, someone else spoke up. Why is he in the dungeon? I heard he was doing something with Miss Amory, another one said with a snigger. I heard he did something to the general's horse. That cloud looks like a horse without a head. Beavid opened his mouth to respond, but others were faster. It's got to be more serious than doing something to the general's horse to get thrown into the pit. Maybe the cloud's a horse in a pit. Oh, look, it's changing. Now it looks like a blob. Mashed potatoes, perhaps, or cotton. The general's always throwing someone in the dungeon. No, he's not. That's just a rumor. Now it looks like a pillow, fluffy and white, without a head. Why make up rumors about the dungeon? To make people scared of him? I'd be scared. I'd be scared if my pillow was a cloud without a head. Enough! Beavid bellowed. The 8 men in front of him each did a little jump. He straightened his jacket and growled under his breath. You should know that Perrin Shin is supposedly from Salem. That's why he's so valuable and so dangerous. The teacher let out a low whistle. From Salem? Wait, how can that be? If he's Thorne's son, found in the woods. No one's entirely sure of how anything is, Beavid said, trying to steer around the doubt that had also entered his mind. Sometimes there were too many stories. He was, after all, an infant when he was found. No one remembers their infancy. I do. I remember lots of clouds and pillows and a horse. No, you don't, Beavid shouted at the Gracina man, who jumped again, pouted, and looked back up at the sky. Beavid clenched his fists and released them. Now, he said, trying to control his growing impatience, during the next few days, we need to learn methods of restraint. That's what you have iron and hammer over here for. The teacher jerked his head toward the massive former Smiths. The blond men elbowed each other in agreement. Exactly what am I needed for in this little security detail? The teacher complained. I don't think I've been placed appropriately. I don't remember taking any tests to see what I'm best suited for. What's my aptitude? I demand to know. Beavid took a deep breath. You're right about iron and hammer, but you, Teach, are to be the brains, allegedly. If Thorne's son begins any little games or tricks, you're supposed to notice and stop him. But I think you're right. You don't belong here. A few of the men snickered, and Teach folded his arms. The brains? I've got more brains than all of you put together. Brains, shouted the Gracina soldier. That's what the cloud looks like now. See how it has all those bumps and ridges? Teach scoffed. As if you could recognize brains. I know brains, he insisted. They look like gray cauliflower. Cauliflower! That cloud looks exactly like... Enough with the clouds! Beavid shouted again. He closed his eyes, sighed heavily, then opened them to see 8 soldiers watching and waiting. Now, as I was saying... He paused. What was I saying? Our duties, sir, said the 6th soldier, standing appropriately at attention. Yes, thank you. We have iron and hammer. We have the Teach. We also have you. He pointed to the two youngest soldiers. You are to keep him company, become his friends. Buddy, he named the first, and Pal, he nodded to the second. The two young soldiers looked at each other in surprise. But we don't know him, Pal started. You'll get to know him. That's your duty. If he becomes your friend, he may confide in you where Salem is. The light slowly came on in their eyes. How about me, sir? The sixth soldier asked, still at attention. Every inch of his brown skin and perfectly combed brown hair under his army-issued cap was stiff with expectation. You'll be my liaison with General Thorne. Messages, concerns, whatever, you'll relay them. You signed up last season, right? Regular Army? Yes, sir. Well then, Reg, you get to behave as regular Army. What about me? Asked the next man in line. Beavid shook his head at his dark, vacant eyes. I'm not entirely sure yet, Cloudman. Cloudman smiled. Beavid turned to the eighth soldier, whose eyes were cold and brittle. And you'll be our lookout man. Watch the terrain, watch Shin, see if anyone is spying on him from the forest, that kind of thing. Sure. Call me Snarl. Beavid's eyebrows went up. I was thinking of an eagle. The man's lip curled, and something dripped from his unkempt brown hair. Snarl it is, Beavid decided. What about me? Said Cloudman eagerly. Still not entirely sure yet, remember? Cloudman smiled. Can I look out for the sky? Yes, make sure it stays in place. Cloudman beamed and gave a warning glare to the sky. Beavid sighed. Private Shin better just be skin and bones. Otherwise, the sergeant would find himself demoted to private. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.